Snakes, Secrets, and the Hafiz's Cry, a moral Islamic tale. In a small village on the outskirts of Lahore, there stood a humble brick house at the end of a muddy dirt road. That evening, a storm rolled in. It wasn't the kind of summer rain that brings relief, but a fierce, vengeful downpour, cold, relentless, soaking to the bone. Inside the cramped kitchen, dimly lit by a flickering oil lamp, sat an old woman hunched with age, her trembling hands clutching a worn-out scarf. Her name was Fatima. The scarf belonged to her daughter Jasmine, a Hafiza, one who had memorized the entire Quran. Everyone in the neighborhood revered Jasmine not only for her beauty but because she was once called the daughter of God. But that night, as thunder cracked across the sky, Fatima sat alone, crying. Rain battered the roof, her tears merging with the storm. Jasmine had not returned from the madrasa, Islamic school, and Fatima knew something was wrong. In Buddhist teachings, there's a concept: karma never arrives randomly. It flows like water beneath the earth, quietly carving trenches beneath our feet without our knowing. As soon as the rain eased, I, a young woman who lived nearby, stepped out with my old flashlight and headed to Fatima's house. Her eyes were bloodshot, her voice hoarse from weeping. She whispered something I still can't forget. She's never late, unless someone or something has kept her forever. With Abdul, an elderly, kind man from the neighborhood, we ventured toward the main road in search of Jasmine. Cold winds swept across the fields. It felt like more than just darkness, it felt like a karmic veil had draped itself over the fate of a young girl. As my flashlight swept across the roadside weeds, I heard a faint sound like a distant cry from beyond the veil. And then I saw Jasmine. Her body lay motionless, blood trickling from her forehead, her dress soaked with mud. Her arms clutched a small, drenched book, perhaps a pocket Quran. The purity once gracing her face, the one who recited the holy verses at dawn, was gone. In its place was something twisted, painful, as if pulled down by hundreds of invisible hands. I screamed. Fatima collapsed, clutching her daughter and wailing. But it wasn't ordinary weeping, it was the raw scream of someone who had lost their last tether to this world. Who did this to my daughter? Who dared? She cried out as if pleading to the heavens, or perhaps confronting the karma of her own life. When we brought Jasmine's body home, a strange unease settled over us all. No one spoke loudly. No one lit incense. And most disturbingly, no one dared look too long at the corpse. Something inside me felt deeply wrong. Not just because she was dead, but because behind the silence something guilty was screaming. In that small house at the village edge, the oil lamp cast trembling shadows onto the walls like spirits searching for escape. The scent of damp earth rose from Jasmine's clothes, as her body was gently placed on an old straw mat. Fatima trembled as she wiped her daughter's face, murmuring verses from the Quran, as if each word might stitch together the soul of her ill-fated child. But the house was too silent. No neighbors recited prayers. No one approached the body. They all stood in the yard, whispering things no one should say during mourning. Some claimed she had been hit by a vehicle. Others stared at the bruises on her neck and muttered, "This wasn't an accident. This was karma." I sat with my mother in the corner, watching Jasmine's bony legs still curled as if she had tried to flee some unseen terror. On her chest, the Quran lay crumpled, blood-soaked pages still open. Fatima sat beside her, holding an ivory white robe. "I want her buried in this," she said in a dry voice. She always said she would wear this when she met Allah. I looked closely. The robe's edges were frayed. A patch had been stitched on the back. A faded yellow stain perhaps from tears marked the fabric. No one objected. No one dared. When it came time to wash the body, Fatima entrusted me and my mother with the task. She handed us a white cloth and whispered, "Please do this as if you are touching an angel." I wanted to. I truly did. But when I lifted her robe, what I saw made my heart leap into my throat. Scratches lined her chest, thin, fresh, and long. Her sides were covered in bruises. And most horrifying, dried blood stained the inside of her thighs. I froze. So did my mother. We said nothing. The prayers caught in our throats. We both knew without saying a word that something far darker lay beneath this death. Fatima didn't know. She couldn't see. Her vision had grown too dim to tell night from day. In her eyes, Jasmine was still the innocent Hafiza who never strayed from the path of light. She believed her daughter died unjustly. As for me, I wasn't sure what to believe anymore. We bathed Jasmine in silence. Water ran red from her body, as if the bleeding hadn't yet ceased. As I dried her wrists, I noticed a thin scratch tracing her vein, and, under her pinky, a deep bruise formed a perfect circle like a rope had been tied tightly. I turned away. I couldn't bear it. When we wrapped her body in the white shroud, Fatima knelt beside her, pressing her face against her daughter's. "You once told me, if you died, I should forgive. Forgive everyone." I didn't understand, but now I do. Maybe, you saw it coming. The funeral passed like a dream. No wailing, except from Fatima. People arrived quietly, left quietly. No one looked directly at the coffin. No candles were lit. No Quran recitations were voiced aloud. At the cemetery, the first thing I felt was a strange chill down my spine. The rain had stopped, but the wind still blew carrying the scent of damp earth and something else I couldn't name. Fear, perhaps. The grave was already dug. A deep, square pit. The soil below was dark like a well, waiting to swallow. As the pallbearers approached, one of them suddenly stopped. "There's something down there," he stammered. "I think it's a snake." I looked down. And I saw it. A thick black snake coiled at the grave's bottom. No movement. No sound. Just waiting. No one dared to proceed. The murmurs began, "It's an omen. Maybe she did something wrong. Even the earth doesn't want her." Fatima screamed, "Stop talking. Bury my child. If this is fate, then I accept it." In the end, no one removed the snake. No one touched it. And so, Jasmine was buried, with the snake. As the earth covered her body, I watched Fatima close her eyes, her lips tight as if tasting the bitterness of poison that seeps into one's soul. And in that moment, I understood, sometimes hell isn't beneath us, it lives in the heart of a grieving mother. If you are still watching this video and wish to pray for Jasmine's soul, please comment the number 7 below to let me know you're here. And if you haven't subscribed yet, I encourage you to do so and click the bell. Your support helps us keep creating meaningful content to inform and inspire you. After the burial, the village returned in silence. No one wanted to speak. No one wanted to think. Only Fatima couldn't turn her back. That night, she sat alone in the corner of her house, her flickering shadow cast against the wall like a soul without a body. I walked over, placing a hand gently on her shoulder. "Auntie, it's late. You should try to sleep." Fatima shook her head. She didn't look at me. She only whispered, "How can I sleep, when my daughter lies in the ground, with a snake. She bowed her head into Jasmine's old robe. I heard her muffled sobs, not loud, but enough to squeeze the breath from my chest. I used to think I understood pain. But that day, I realized I was wrong. A mother's grief isn't in the crying. It's in the silence that comes after the tears have run dry. The next morning, I was preparing to bring over some food when a neighbor whispered to me, "Hey, don't go yet. Something strange happened." I stepped outside and followed the direction everyone was pointing. And then I saw it, on the front steps of Fatima's house, a cluster of black snakes lay coiled on the brick tiles. They weren't slithering. They just lay there still as statues, yet an eerie chill radiated from them that made anyone passing by shiver. Fatima didn't scream. She didn't try to drive them away. She simply sat there, holding a cold cup of tea, her eyes vacant. When I approached, she looked at me for the first time with eyes completely void of life. They came, because she's still here. Her soul hasn't moved on. I stepped closer to the snakes. Their eyes opened. Snake eyes are usually black and empty, but these were blood red. And I swear, I saw something that looked almost like anger in their gaze. The village panicked. Some said this was karma. Others suggested relocating Fatima. But she refused. Each day, she still swept the yard, still cooked meals, and still visited the cemetery, like it was a sacred ritual. One evening, when the sunset bathed the village in crimson, I saw her dressed in white, her head covered with a scarf, walking slowly toward the graveyard. I followed. She didn't speak, only gestured for silence. We arrived at Jasmine's grave. And I couldn't believe my eyes. The grave was pitch black, not from the soil, but from dozens of snakes covering it. They lay quietly, but every now and then, they coiled and lifted their heads, as if guarding something. Fatima knelt, her hands trembling as she dug at the earth, whispering her daughter's name. I tried to pull her back, but she resisted. I know she can still hear me. I need to apologize. I shouted. Auntie, stop. You don't know what you're doing. Look around you, Yuri sitting in the middle of snakes. She didn't listen. Then she began to cry out. Jasmine. What more do you want? I gave you the robe, the prayers, my whole life. What more do you want from me? The wind picked up. The grass around the grave swayed violently. I heard hissing, not one, but many, in unison. The air turned icy, like the breath had been pulled from the earth itself. I grabbed Fatima tightly and whispered, "Let's go, please." We left the grave. But that night, I couldn't sleep. I dreamt. Jasmine stood at the foot of my bed, her entire body soaked, still clutching the torn Quran, her eyes wide open, lips tightly shut, and around her neck, a snake was wrapped like a cold funeral garland. She said nothing. Just stared. For a long time. When I finally shot awake, drenched in sweat, I could still see her gaze lingering beyond the curtain. The next morning, I rushed to Fatima's house to tell her about the dream, but she was already out. I walked into Jasmine's room. And then, I saw the phone. It lay beneath her pillow, screen still lit. A device no one knew she even had. When I picked it up, my heart nearly stopped. Inside were videos. Images. Clips that should never belong to a Hafiza. Should never belong to anyone who devoted her life to reciting sacred verses. I stood in Jasmine's old room where tiny handprints still marked the dusty wall, where Quran study schedules were taped above the bed, where cut-out images of mosques lined the corners, and where her prayer scarf still held the faint scent of fragrant oil. But among all that, was the smartphone under her pillow. No password. No fingerprint lock. The screen lit up as soon as I pressed the power button like it wanted to be seen, exposed. I hesitated. Then I swiped up. The first thing I saw wasn't messages or selfies, but a folder titled Private misspelled as Private. Inside were dozens of video files. I opened one. And I froze. On the screen wasn't Jasmine. It was explicit, vulgar, filthy content. She didn't film them, but her voice, it was unmistakably hers. In some clips, she appeared behind the camera, giggling. In others, she was clearly holding the phone, secretly recording her dorm mates as they changed clothes. I didn't want to believe it. My hands shook. But each new file only confirmed it further. This was no longer the Jasmine we knew. She didn't just record. She distributed them. The comments beneath the videos were from strangers' fake names, vile emojis. And worst of all, some of the videos had been edited, superimposing her classmates' faces onto obscene content, then spreading them anonymously. I collapsed onto the floor. My heart pounded like it might explode. My chest hurt like someone had clutched it with cold, merciless hands. I looked around the tiny room. The Quranic verses still hung on the walls. The paper notes that said Allah is light still clung with old tape. Was it all a lie? Was she two-faced? Or was she a soul lost between light and shadow? I didn't know. I only knew one thing: I had to find Fatima. I ran outside, gripping the phone. The rain had returned, each drop hitting my face like a cleansing punishment for what I had just witnessed. I found Fatima sitting on her doorstep, clutching her prayer beads, her lips repeating, La ilaha illallah. La ilaha illallah. I sat beside her. My hands trembled. I placed the phone down. You need to see this. Fatima looked up at me. No suspicion. No anger. Just a strange calmness, as though she was prepared to face anything, even the cruelest truth. I opened the folder named Private. She didn't look at the screen. It's Jasmine, I whispered. She remained silent. Then the first sound played: her daughter's laughter, tangled with images that made any heart shatter with shame. Fatima slowly bowed her head. She didn't scream. She didn't cry. She didn't curse her daughter. She simply removed her headscarf and covered her face. It's my fault, she said in a raspy voice. I didn't see it. I didn't ask. I just trusted her completely. That entire afternoon, I stayed with her. The rain kept falling, as if it wanted to wash away the sin. But no rain could ever cleanse what had just been revealed. And then, when the skies cleared, a young woman stepped into the house. She was about 20, thin and pale. Her eyes were swollen, her hand clutched her headscarf tightly. She said, I used to study with Jasmine. I'm one of the girls she secretly recorded, many times. Fatima didn't raise her head. Didn't move. The girl continued. I didn't come to accuse. I came to forgive. Because I know she no longer has the chance to make it right. But if anything can still save Jasmine's soul, it might be the truth. I looked at Fatima. She nodded gently. Come with me. To her room. We returned to Jasmine's room. The girl walked straight to the bed. She opened every drawer. Checked under the pillows. Finally, she lifted the mattress. Beneath it was a small black USB stick. She plugged it into her phone and opened the files. It wasn't just videos. There was also a list of people who had paid to watch them. An underground network. And at the center was the girl buried with a snake. Jasmine's room no longer felt like a sanctuary of holy dreams. It had become a crime scene, a fallen temple amidst a storm of sin. That tiny black USB stick was like a doorway to hell, hidden beneath clean bed sheets. Secrets no one in the village would have dared to imagine, now lay bare before us. Fatima sat slumped by the bed, her head resting on her knees. She didn't ask questions. She didn't deny anything. All the excuses, although my daughter could never do this, had evaporated like smoke. "If I go to the police," she said in a voice as soft as wind through bamboo, "I'll kill what's left of her. She'll be smeared, dragged through the papers, cursed. But if I stay silent, will her soul ever rest?" The victim girl stood in the corner, her fingers nervously intertwined. "You don't need to report it. I've already forgiven her. I just believe, maybe Allah sent me here, to set her free from the snakes, from the pain she carried even after death." No one said anything else. No verses were recited aloud. The room became as still as a funeral shroud stretched tight across the sky, waiting for one final wind to tear it apart. That night, Fatima gathered all that was left of her daughter, a Quran notebook, the scarf she used for prayers, and the USB stick. She placed them into an old wooden box, locked it with a rusty wire, and brought it to my house. "Keep this for me," she said. "I don't want to see it, but I don't have the strength to burn it." I nodded, holding the box as if cradling a trembling soul. As she turned away, I saw her shoulders shrink as if a burden had been lifted, but something in her soul had faded with it. 2 days later, she returned to the grave. No one went with her this time. But I quietly followed, hiding beneath the dense trees. I wasn't at peace. That night, the moon was full and low. Its light touched every blade of wild grass, every gravestone exposing all in its cold, white glow. Fatima knelt before her daughter's grave. I saw she didn't cry. She simply placed her hand on the soil, now dark and firm. "You betrayed your vow, you betrayed the light, but I'm still here." A black snake rose from the grave's edge, slowly slithering toward her. But unlike before, it wasn't aggressive. It circled her once, then returned to the mound. She took a white scarf from her robe, the one Jasmine used during Quran lessons, and laid it gently over the grave. "If you truly went astray, then take this scarf as my final offering of atonement. I forgive you. And I pray the Almighty does too." The wind rose. Strong. Cold. But it no longer carried anger. Only sorrow. The next day, Fatima went to the market for the first time in nearly 3 weeks. She stepped out in daylight. She sat by the gate, spread out a cloth. On it were all that remained of her daughter, a few old clothes, some kitchen bowls, a handful of cheap jewelry. She called out to passers-by, extending her hand. "Take something. Even if it's just a spoon. Please, do it for her soul." The villagers whispered. Some shed tears. Others turned away, unable to bear the pain in her eyes. From a distance, I watched a mother sell pieces of her daughter's memory, in exchange for forgiveness. That night, I visited her house. There were no snakes at the doorstep. Only a few winding marks left in the sand. The door was ajar. I stepped inside. She was sitting in prayer. Alone. In silence. No candles, No recitations, only absolute stillness. I gently touched her shoulder. "Are you okay?" She smiled, the first smile I had seen in days, but then said something that made my chest tighten. "Tonight is the first night I can sleep without dreaming of snakes." If you're still watching this video and want to express gratitude that Jasmine's soul has found peace, please comment the number 1 below to let me know you're here. And if you haven't subscribed, I encourage you to do so and hit the bell. Your support helps us continue creating meaningful content to inform and inspire you. 1 week after Fatima laid the white scarf on her daughter's grave, the sun returned after long days of gloom. The rain ceased, the sky lit up with the sharp brilliance of seasonal winds. I went to the cemetery one early morning, carrying white chrysanthemums, planning to quietly place them on Jasmine's grave. But when I arrived, I froze. There were no snakes on the grave. Not one. No shadows, no hissing sounds, no winding tracks in the grass. Just a dry, smooth mound, like nothing strange had ever occurred here. The white scarf still lay there, fluttering in the early breeze like a paper crane, unstained, unmoved. My heart clenched. How was this possible? I stepped slowly, afraid my footsteps might shatter some fragile miracle. I knelt beside the grave, barely breathing. The air smelled different, less of damp earth, and more like sandalwood. A deep, weathered voice spoke behind me. "Child, what you see now is the fruit of sacrifice." I turned. An old man in a white robe, with long silver beard and eyes deep as an ancient well. In his hand was a black wooden prayer bead strand, each bead the size of a thumb. I recognized him immediately, Maulana Yusuf, the elder priest from the town beyond the mountain. A man who rarely showed himself in busy places. "You knew?" I whispered. He nodded. "I knew, even before the girl died. I saw her at the madrasa a few times. Her eyes were restless. Her recitation interrupted, not from forgetting, but from a divided heart." I was stunned. "But she was a Hafiza. A devoted daughter, she dash." "She was human," he interrupted. "And humans are weak. Not because they desire to sin, but because sometimes, no one shows them the right path in time." He stepped closer to the grave, knelt, and ran his hand along the mound. His thin hands trembled slightly, but his gaze was firm as a mountain. Fatima didn't try to cover it up. She faced her daughter's sins with the courage of a mother willing to sacrifice her honor to ask for forgiveness. And that is what changed the direction of karma. I shivered. Then, what were the snakes? Punishment. Manifestation. "The snakes didn't punish her," he replied. "They were the fear in everyone's hearts, taking form. When a soul dies with unpurged sin, its dark energy draws entities from the same plane. Snakes are merely the symbols of that." I asked him. "But why did they disappear? Why is there nothing today?" He smiled softly. "Because that mother gave up everything she had, from possessions to pride, in a plea for redemption. In this universe, nothing is stronger than unconditional love. And sometimes, that very love softens even the earth." I looked back at Jasmine's grave. Suddenly, from a small gap between the soil and the scarf laid over it, a tiny green sprout pushed through. Vibrant. Fragile. Maulana Yusuf placed a hand on my shoulder. "Don't be afraid. The girl has been forgiven. But it is the living, the witness, the one holding the truth, who must carry on. Tell this story. Not to frighten, but to save those walking the same path." My throat tightened. If I tell it, people will think it's just a tale to scare children. "That's all right," he said. Those who have never seen the gaze of snakes from the other side will always believe death is the end. That evening, I returned to Fatima's house. She was quietly sewing Jasmine's old robe, each needle stroke slow and delicate like she was mending a torn soul. I told her everything that had happened at the graveyard. She didn't cry. She wasn't surprised. She only looked up, smiling faintly, her hands never stopping. My daughter finally found the light. I believe that. And in the last golden rays of day spilling through the window, I saw it clearly, on the wall where Jasmine once pinned photos of mosques, now hung a handwritten note in shaky black ink. Mother, I'm sorry. And thank you. After the day Fatima sat sewing her daughter's robe, something inside me remained unsettled. The story seemed to have ended with the snakes disappearing from Jasmine's grave, but for me, it felt like a door had opened, leading to paths no one had ever walked before. I thought of the phone. And the messages on it. In the wave of pain and compassion I had felt for Fatima, I hadn't fully checked the data. But now, as the night fell silent, I reopened Jasmine's message folder not to judge, but to understand. To listen to her, one last time. The last message was sent at 9:03 p.m. the night Jasmine died, just minutes before the storm began. The recipient's name, S.K. Its content was brief. I can't do this anymore. I'm scared. I feel guilty. A minute later, a reply from S.K. Too late. Either you keep going, or I'll tell everyone what you did in the girls' bathroom on Friday. I froze. The next message from Jasmine wasn't a reply. It was a short video, her own face, soaked with tears, lips trembling. And one whisper echoed through the recording. If I die, don't let my mother regret giving birth to me. I pulled out the headphones. The room was deathly silent, like the world itself was holding its breath. In my head, the name S.K. rang like a distorted bell over a graveyard. I decided to return to the madrasa where Jasmine once studied, where she had spent hours reciting the Quran, where people had trusted her. I needed to know, who was S.K. and who was the last person to push her over the edge. Madrasa Al-Rahim was a small school on the edge of a hill, its red-tiled roof aged and worn, its iron gate rusted. I arrived at noon, just as the girls were filing out of class. Their giggles echoed through the courtyard, a stark contrast to the weight crushing my chest. I met Ustad Hafiz, the Quran class supervisor, a thin man, stern-faced but with gentle eyes. Jasmine was a good student, he said when I asked. But a few months ago, she changed. Grew quiet. Missed classes. Her eyes were always red, like she had just cried. Did she have any close friends? I asked. He thought for a moment, then nodded slightly. There was one. Sarah Khan. But after Jasmine's death, she quit school. Vanished without a trace. Sarah Khan. SK. It didn't take me long to find Sarah. She lived in a makeshift slum along the highway where rooftops were patched together with scrap metal, and every sound echoed like it was carved in tin. When I arrived, Sarah was curled up by a splintered wooden table, eyes hollow, hugging her knees like an abandoned cat. She was so thin the wind could have carried her away. I sat beside her, saying nothing. I just placed Jasmine's phone in front of her. The screen showed their conversation. Sarah stared at it for a long time, then broke down. I didn't think she'd go that far. Her voice cracked dry, brittle like glass hitting stone. Why? I asked, unable to hold back my emotions. Why would you threaten someone like that? You knew she was fragile. You knew better than anyone. Sarah shot up, fists clenched. Because she recorded me too. It was her. But she apologized. Said she'd delete it. Then I found out she still had the file. I was angry. I hated her. I just wanted to scare her. I didn't know she'd choose death. Her voice broke. I saw real terror in her eyes. Not the look of a malicious mastermind, but of someone who had been hurt and passed that pain on, unknowingly pushing it too far. I came to the funeral, but I couldn't go inside. I saw the snakes. I knew it was my fault. Why didn't you tell Fatima? I asked. Sarah looked down at her trembling hands. Because I was afraid. But now, if she's still willing to listen, I'll speak. I'll kneel at Jasmine's grave if that's what it takes to let her soul rest. That evening, I brought Sarah to the cemetery. Fatima was sitting beside the grave, laying down a few wildflowers. When she saw Sarah, she didn't react. She simply asked gently, "Who are you, child?" Sarah knelt, placing her forehead to the soil. "I'm the one who caused your daughter's death." A breeze rose, stirring loose cloth, rustling leaves, and the choked sob of a mother who had just met the one behind her loss. Fatima didn't slap her. Didn't scream. Didn't turn her away. She simply placed her hand on Sarah's head, and said, "You, and she, were both victims of being lost. The sin has been revealed. Live to make it right, don't die from fear." 3 days after that fateful encounter at the graveyard, Sarah was never seen again in the slum neighborhood. People said she left in the middle of the night, leaving behind only a single handwritten note tucked beneath her worn headscarf. "I will live." Because she died to help me understand that. No one knew where she went, but all signs pointed toward her old school, Madrasa Al-Rahim, once a sacred space, a root, and also the birthplace of a tragedy buried in silence. 3 weeks after Jasmine's burial, the madrasa held its first ever confessional gathering for female students. Something that had never happened in the school's 20-year history. That evening, under the breezy open courtyard, more than 100 students gathered around the soft glow of yellow lights. On a simple wooden platform set in the center, a lone microphone buzzed softly. Sarah stepped forward. No headscarf. No makeup to hide the dark circles under her eyes. Just a thin girl, still trembling, voice still hoarse but her eyes, strangely bright. "I was Jasmine's friend. I was someone who hurt her. And today, I stand here not to speak of death, but of the silence that killed her." No one interrupted. No one laughed. Sarah told the story from beginning to end, nothing held back. The hidden recordings, the foolish retaliation, the threatening messages, the rainy night of her death, and the snakes that lingered around the grave for days. Jasmine wasn't a monster. She was a young soul, carrying darkness in her heart that no one noticed. She made mistakes. But instead of helping her correct them, we, myself included, buried her deeper. When I threatened to expose her, I didn't know I was tying a noose around my friend's neck. A long silence followed. Sarah stepped down. There was no applause, no whispering. But everyone saw, teary eyes, tightly held hands, and a silent wave stirring inside each young girl, a moment of awakening. The following week, the school placed an anonymous letterbox in the center courtyard so anyone burdened by secrets, pain, or fear could write them down, and ask for help. On the first day, there were 4 notes. On the second, 17. By the second week, they had to add another box. Hastily scribbled lines, ink smudged by tears, words of confession, pleas for help, cries for forgiveness. Some spoke of being filmed in secret, some of abuse at home, and others simply admitted they felt numb while reading the Quran and guilty for that. I brought the first handful of notes to Fatima's house. She sat by the window, light resting on her aged but gentle eyes. As I explained what was happening, she nodded quietly, her hand gently clutching the scarf that had once covered Jasmine's grave. My daughter has become a voice, even when she's no longer here. Perhaps, this is the final apology she wanted to leave behind for the world. One Friday morning, I returned to Jasmine's grave. The little sprout I had once seen had grown into a small flowering bush, white petals blooming brightly in the sun as if to remind us that death is never the end, so long as love continues to grow. Next to the bush, someone had placed a piece of wood, carved by hand in shaky letters. Here rests a girl who lost her way, and because of it, hundreds found theirs. Sarah had now re-enrolled in school, this time, in educational psychology. She applied to be a counseling assistant at the madrasa, working with students facing mental health struggles, especially those suffering from bullying or hiding painful secrets. On her first day back, Fatima visited her. She hugged her for a long time. You still have a chance. Live in a way that honors both of you and Jasmine. I once believed Jasmine's story had ended like a prayer, soft, solemn, and peaceful. But then, a week after Sarah started her new role at Madrasa Al-Rahim, something strange happened. A student went missing. Her name was Zainab, 15 years old. Quiet, underperforming, but diligent. On Monday morning, she submitted a complaint accusing a male teacher who taught applied Islamic ethics of harassment. That afternoon, she never returned home. No one saw her leave the school. No cameras. No witnesses. Only a torn piece of paper blown to the back courtyard, with a single line still visible in purple ink. If someone finds this note, please know. I tried to speak up. Sarah was the first to find the note. And this time, she didn't stay silent. That night, Sarah searched every classroom, every prayer room, every shadowy corner, places where footsteps had once gone unnoticed, just like Jasmine's. I went with her. We didn't need flashlights. We had learned how to see clearly in the dark after so many haunted nights. At the end of the hallway behind the madrasa, where an old book storage once stood, Sarah stopped. She stepped forward and opened the rotting wooden door. In the moonlit shadows, Zainab sat in the corner, dirty and terrified, clinging to a Quran, her hands trembling. I didn't know where else to go, she whispered. I was scared they'd silence me like they did Jasmine. Sarah knelt down, wrapping Zainab tightly in her arms. They both cried. You did the right thing, she said. And this time, no one will leave you alone. The incident was brought to light. The teacher was suspended, then investigated by local authorities. The madrasa appointed a new headmaster, and a girls' safety council was formed with Sarah as its leader. From a death shrouded in darkness, Jasmine had become the first light guiding others forward. On Jasmine's first death anniversary, Fatima wore white and brought the embroidered scarf to her daughter's grave. Now, the grave bloomed with vibrant flowers, not just white blossoms, but roses, daisies, and lavender, small gifts from the girls who had been saved by her story. She didn't cry. She simply whispered, "You still live, in every heart that dares to listen." I returned home, sat by the window, and looked up at the starry sky. I thought about everything: the snakes around the grave, the unlocked phone, the final message in the rain, and how fear had been transformed into courage. And I knew this story had to be told. Not just to remember Jasmine, but to remind all of us, the ones still living, how to stop, to listen, and to save a soul before it's too late. Thank you for joining us today. We would love to hear your thoughts. Leave a comment below and share one thing you learned today and how you plan to carry it into your life. Your voice matters to us, so don't hesitate to share. Reading your words brings us motivation and inspiration. If you found this video helpful, please like, subscribe, and share. Your support helps us continue creating meaningful content to inform and uplift you. Thank you for watching, and we look forward to seeing you in the next video.